Welcome to the March 11th meeting of the Planning Commission Transportation Committee meeting. We continue to operate in a virtual environment, so we ask for your patience as we switch between speakers and presentations. Today, we will be continuing our conversation from our last meeting about TIAs, and we'll also be talking about multimodal frontage requirements. Transportation staff are here to discuss those topics and to answer any questions we might have. I understand that no one is here from the public to offer comment, so I will hand it over to transportation staff to begin their presentation. I will note that because this meeting is immediately preceding the committee of the whole meeting at 4, we will be ending approximately 10 minutes to 4, so we can transition to that meeting. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Okay, thank you. This is Ann Conlon with Transportation Planning. So at the previous meeting, I gave a presentation discussing traffic impact analysis at rezoning and walking through the goal, the triggers, what's required, and outcomes. So I think my understanding was that you want to just continue some of the question and answer on that. I have my slides at hand if we want to pull them up. But I'm happy if any of you all have specific questions to respond to those.
Does anybody have any questions from the previous TIA discussion? Or do you want to we can move on to the multimodal frontage requirements, and if we think of questions for Ann or Eric, we can ask them at the end. Okay, I think that's what we'll do, Ann. So Eric, I guess you're up.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Very good. I am Eric Lamb. I am the Transportation Planning Manager with the city's Transportation Department. And so what I'm going to cover with you today is just sort of a basic overview about how we handle development. And this is different from, for example, what the Planning Commission sees now on the zoning and entitlement side, and more on the side of how we exact public improvements from new development and what our boundaries and limitations are associated with that. So let's see if I can share my screen. Good deal. So we'll start with the Unified Development Ordinance, because that is really, from our standpoint, the basis from which all standards flow. And as we've developed this, when we look at modality, we're concerned with 4 primary things. 1 is vehicular flow for general purpose vehicles, 2 is pedestrians, 3 is bicycles, and 4 is transit. I'm going to apologize. My canine assistant would like to come join the call, so we'll let her do that. Otherwise, she'll whine and distract. I may have another one that comes and joins me and is not as friendly. So, but we have all of our street sections outlined in the UDO, and in each manner you can see how different modes are incorporated into streets. So, I started here on the Avenue 4-lane divided, primarily because this is sort of the most common, I think, that we see for major streets and development along major streets. And our standards for this, basically, looking at a full 4-lane section, conventional bike lanes on the outside, a planted verge with street trees, and then sidewalks. And one of the things I think you may see or hear reference to is sometimes as we look at, I'll do that a little better. As we look at what this standard design looks like, we do sometimes run into issues with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And it gets into this notion of what they refer to as clear zones. And NCDOT, for the most part, still utilizes sort of an old school approach to clear zones and recovery, in many ways treating major roads in some ways, almost like highways. Our standards allow for the planting of street trees. We like that on multiple fronts, both from an aesthetic standpoint and the creation of a better space between the travel lanes and the pedestrian realm that make for a more enjoyable pedestrian space. But at the current time, we have to follow the state standards. We do have some latitude when there's bike lanes in place and certain types of trees are used, and we try and exercise that when we can. But otherwise, DOT requires the street trees to be located behind the sidewalks in those cases, and we work that out on a case-by-case basis. But primarily, this is sort of the fundamental starting point. There's different types of cross sections that we've got in the city code in the UDO. In this case, for example, you'll notice with the main street that there is no specific bicycle infrastructure associated with this type of design. And the implication here is that a main street scenario is meant to be such a low speed, low volume environment with the interaction of the on-street parking that bicycles would move comfortably within that shared space with the cars. There's some debate on whether or not that is the right approach long term, but that's where we're at today currently with that standard. We've got other standards for avenue 3-lane parallel parking. This is similar, for example, to what we're installing in the Cameron Village area. But we're starting to see now more migration based on newer design standards that would flip the location of the bike lane with the parked cars. And what that would do is some folks like to call that a protected bike lane. Others call it a separated bike lane. But we're seeing that start to become of greater interest. There's some trade-offs that go along with that. One of the upsides is that it makes for a narrower street footprint from edge to edge here, so that the friction of the on-street parking is happening closer to the travel lanes. And the thought there is that helps keeps the speed on these streets down. One of the challenges is it puts the bikes over against the curb, and at intersections, you have to be careful to daylight those intersections, because otherwise the parked cars will hide cyclists from drivers on the main line, and that can create issues at intersections. So the bottom line here is that the UDO controls the standards for what those nature of our frontage improvements are, and how we apply those to development plans. So let me pause here for a second and go out. So I think one of the things that's most fundamental about what we do with development plans, let me find a good example. I apologize, you're going on a virtual tour of the city with me here. So for example, as we have new development, we have the ability to require a couple different things. One is impacts to a site that are based on traffic impacts. So for example, you're generating the need for a new traffic signal, or you're generating the need for additional turn lanes. We have some ability to require developers to mitigate the nature of their impacts. The other thing that we have the ability to do is what are known as exactions. And that is where we can require, as part of the construction and development of a site, that the frontage is built out according to certain standards. Now, as I was showing you this cross sections before, that we've got the city, we've got standards for each different type of classification. One thing that I'll point out is that we also have a street plan, and Raleigh is a fairly, I'll call it well planned. Some may disagree, but it's very much a planned city in the regard that we've gone through the entire major street network and applied a classification and a standard for what each street needs to be based on the ultimate development of the city as proposed in the 2030 comprehensive plan. In reality, our forecasting, because now it's 2021, 2030 is only 9 years away. In reality, our forecasting, as we work with the regional metropolitan planning organizations, actually happens on more of a 30-year time frame. So looking at what the full build out and growth of not just Raleigh, but all of the member cities in the MPO would be, based on land use assumptions and what the yield would be and when that land develops. That gives us an idea to look at forecasts for what types of traffic volumes we could expect on some of these major corridors. And that starts to then inform us on how large these streets need to be. And so we've gone through and applied that to all the major streets in the city. Everything that you see in the teal here are all classified as 4-lane divided avenues. There's a couple of categories. For example, if you see everything in the blue, those are designated as future 6-lane streets. The purple with a white stripe is a 2-lane divided, which could either be 2 travel lanes with a center median or 2 travel lanes with a center turn lane. It's effectively the same standard, and we apply that in specific contexts. And then the solid purple line is a 2-lane avenue, and that is 2 lanes of traffic with no separation between. And so as the site comes in to develop, one of the very first things that our development review staff does is consult the comp plan and see what is the classification of each street that these streets front along. And so this is a good example of a shopping center site that was done sort of on the edges of Southeast Raleigh. This is at the intersection of Rock Quarry Road and Battle Bridge Road. So as this development came in, up until a previous point, this part of Rock Quarry Road was a 2-lane road. And so let's see if we can do this here and get a good view. And I'm going to back it up down here to this part. There we go. So as you can see, much of the area was developed originally as these 2-lane, farm to market roads. And that was the original backbone. And in many cases, within the past 50 years, some of these streets haven't been paved roads that entire time. I can remember going to public meetings in North Raleigh and meeting people that talked about the fact that parts of Falls of Noose Road were not paved in the 1970s, early 1970s, north of Millbrook Road. Some people can remember that. But as we apply urban standards to urbanizing areas, then we look at, that's why you see these areas you see dead pavement where the road's been widened, the sidewalk's been built, but it's not being used for anything. Sometimes you'll see this space used as an interim turn lane, for example, and striped out. But in reality, we're requiring these developers to build out the entire cross-section of the street based on those adopted standards. Now, in a case like this, that sort of looks like a bike lane, but we've not got it designated as one. But you can see how with the widening that's been done over here, again, the developer is required to build out per that cross-section along their frontage, and we're able to utilize that and create a center turn lane, improve some of the capacity and safety associated with a situation like this. So that gets us to dealing with the frontage, where the limitation really sits is, let's see if I can do this. There we go, stop here. There we go. So where the limitation exists is when we start to look at moving beyond the frontage of what that actual development application is. Now, there are certain cases where we have the ability to work with the developer to say, contextually, oh, look, there's a sidewalk that's 50 feet away from where you're stopping your sidewalk at your property line. Is there a way that we can work out with the developer to come in and build that missing link of sidewalk? And in most cases, unless there's a really strong geographic, topographic, environmental reason of why that sidewalk link doesn't exist, most developers are willing to work with us on that. We have certain abilities to reimburse developers for off-site improvements in that type of situation. And so we're able to work with them, but in more of a cooperative manner, not in a requirement manner. And that word require is really important because that ties to our legal authority and what is it we can force someone to do as opposed to partner with them for making improvements. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So we're constrained by the code and what our development standards are for what we can do with an individual development. Now, where things get a little bit different is when you get into the realm of zoning. And in zoning, and I'll lean on Mr. York and legal counsel here to keep me straight, make sure the transportation engineer isn't saying anything that's out of bounds. But effectively, there is the ability to have conversations with the development community. And oftentimes developers want to look at adding conditions to cases that would help, I'd say, curry favor with the nature of an application. And in those cases, developers can offer to make certain extra offsite improvements and can tie those to a phase of development or some condition that's being met. But again, it's not something that we can require. It's not something we can make a developer. You can never make a developer add a condition to a case. Oftentimes, it's really contextual. Again, one of the other limitations here is, our ability to require is limited by what's in the code. So if there's things that we want to change within the code to be able to make different types of requirements, that requires a very deliberate process. We went through that a couple of years ago because one of the things that we found on a regular basis was that there were frequently conditions that were being offered as part of zoning cases that specifically had to do with transit elements. And that became a sticking point in conversations and became an expectation, I would say, from some of the Planning Commission members at the time, that these development cases would automatically include some provision for transit-related improvements as part of the development. And with that repeated condition coming about over and over again, we then worked to introduce a text change to create some specific conditions and clear expectations of the development community when those transit improvements would and would not be required. So we did create a requirement in the code to add those conditions in associated with the site. We also created the ability for certain cases to pay a fee in lieu of providing some transit infrastructure if there were certain conditions that were met. But that was the first time that we had really put in place hard rules about transit infrastructure. The thing that's now starting to emerge in conversation is cycling infrastructure. And there's a lot that's happening of all of the realms that we deal in. Bicycle infrastructure is probably the most fluid because of changes that have happened over the last 10 to 15 years where we first included bike lanes as part of the city's adopted standards when the UDO was adopted in 2013. So prior to 2013, we did not have set standards for bike lanes as part of the frontage improvements of a street. That's now the case, but what's interesting is that the landscape has changed, and I'm going to share my screen again here. And there we go. So if you're not familiar with this is the Art Museum frontage on Blue Ridge Road. And there has become a more stronger preference for what we call separated facilities. And so as part of a collaboration with the Art Museum, they came to us and said we wanted to do something different than just the standard along Blue Ridge Road. And we started talking about the idea of building a separated bike lane behind the curb along Blue Ridge. And so you can see we've got a small grass verge here. We've got a 5-foot asphalt bike lane, and then a 7 or 8 foot strip here between the bike lane and the sidewalk with tree plantings. This is a state maintained road, and these tree plantings do meet state standards in this specific instance. And then about a 6-foot sidewalk over here behind the tree lawn. So, and actually, spoiler alert, this is a little bit of a preview for an upcoming conversation that we're going to be having with the Planning Commission, hopefully, as we are taking a request for a text change to the City Council next week to talk about altering our standards to on these major avenue type facilities to eliminate bike lanes and move that bicycle infrastructure behind the curb. There's some interesting trade-offs to be meriting discussion when this comes before the Planning Commission and ultimately City Council. It does require a little bit of extra right-of-way dedication above what is currently the standard behind the curb. We think there's an offset for that because the standard for building this type of pavement behind the curb is lower than building the bike lane inside of the footprint of the roadway. And it has to do with load, pavement depth, thickness. So this should be a less expensive measure to ask development to be able to provide. But it comes with the offset of requiring a couple of extra feet of dedication of right of way. And again, that's one of those, that ability to require developers to dedicate right of way, commit private land to public resources is part of what we've got with the state law and defined by our code. This was a good example of a developer, again, being the art museum, willing to try something new and different. The challenge becomes, because this is not yet our current standard, and I'll pick on the other side of the street here, which is the being proposed as DHHS, but let's assume it was a private developer. Because we don't have these standards yet in place, the standard for frontage improvements along Blue Ridge Road would be a conventional bike lane. And one of the challenges that we've experienced is, in a couple of cases, we've had developers that were interested in doing the improvements and going ahead and building a cross section like you see on the east side of the street here. But because our standards don't technically allow this, it requires a variance procedure, which I know was through the Board of Adjustment. David, you can confirm, is that still in Board of Adjustment, or is that now under the Appearance Commission's purview for something like that?
The Appearance Commission, I believe, is now handling that.
Okay. Regardless, it still requires a variance with a quasi-judicial hearing to go through and change that standard out. And we've been supportive of that, but oftentimes as you see cases come through, there's a lot of push from a timing perspective relative to the financial pressures and real estate pressures and whatnot that those developers are under. So there's a reticence to going through that process and seeking that variance. But we're hopeful that as we move through the process and start to make these modifications to the code, we eliminate that situation. The good news is in
Sorry, just to clarify, Eric, you keep saying variance. I mean, it's the design alternates that are going to the Appearance Commission. So some of the transportation issues are being addressed by design alternates. If they can't be addressed by a design alternate, it'll go to the BOA for variance, just to clarify.
Good deal. Thank you for setting my vocabulary straight. I really do appreciate that. Okay, so I guess the other issue has to do with that nature of off-site improvements and our ability to require developers to do that work off-site. What I was going to say was in situations where, let me find a good example. Let's pretend in this case this is a bike lane here, and we don't have that facility built behind the curb yet. There's some concern about, as these developers, we're exacting these frontage improvements from them, that we're not getting these back of curb facilities. And that's true on a single site basis. The good news is we're still requiring developers to dedicate additional right of way. So at such time that we want to come back, we have the ability to move this curb line in and reset the curb line on the edge of the travel lane and build either a wider sidewalk or multi-use path behind the curb, or build a separated bike facility in this place. So that's the upside, is that we're still getting that dedication of public space that allows the city to come back at a later date and make that modification and make for a complete facility. One of the challenges sometimes is, stop sharing. One of the challenges with our approach can be the piecemeal nature of those types of frontage improvements. You get a development here and they build all their section out. Then you got a gap that's still 2 lanes. Then developer here builds their section out. So you're still left with that in between section that either would get addressed with future private development or some type of public investment where the city comes in, or NCDOT, and finishes that widening. And that happens on a regular basis. The nice thing about when we do get these exactions and these frontage improvements, 9 times out of 10, when we come back to build a public project, we're not disrupting those frontages. We're able to utilize the curb and gutter and the sidewalk and the infrastructure that the developers have put in previously. And we're not making any disruption to the tenants or the business owners that are along that frontage. And there's a lot of value in that. Sometimes we do, sometimes as standards change, we have to go back and remove infrastructure that the developer may have installed. That happens less often than when we're able to preserve it, but it does happen sometimes. So, Ms. Bennett, I've covered sort of a lot of different things and maybe hopefully in a logical sequence, but I think probably would be a good point now to open it up to questions from the commission and from the committee and see what your thoughts are.
Thank you, Eric. That was very informative. Commissioner Winters has a question.
Thank you. Eric, thank you so much for this, because one, it was very informative, and I'm excited to see like the barrier between bike and traffic. And you answered the first question I had about, because in some areas of Raleigh, I do see that protective barrier. And then in other places I hadn't. So you answered the question that it was more so private development that does that. That was like an incentive. So thank you for that. That was my first question. And I understand that this is going to text change, but I'm wondering, has any thought been given to when there's no new development? Let's say there's, well, first of all, second question, my next question was my first question, second comment, was you said major streets. How would that be classified? So let me explain. When you said major street, I'm thinking Glenwood, Capitol, major arteries. Mm-hmm. So is that what you all are thinking when you say major streets, or do you have something an idea somewhat scaled back?
So specifically, the text change that we're requesting addresses several classes of avenues. Okay, so from the UDO, it's a 2-lane avenue, 2-lane divided avenue, 4-lane avenue, and 6-lane avenue. So those are the ones that we're bringing forward that would be covered under this proposed text change if council authorizes it.
Okay. Just forgive me if this is an ignorant question, but when you're saying 2, 4, and 6-lane avenue, will it help me understand, does it currently have the designation of avenue now? Like Glenwood Avenue?
Yes. Yes. So that's actually, you raised a really good point, because we're not proposing with this text change to change any of the classifications of the street. It would just change the standard that's applied to those existing classifications. So Falls of Noosh Road, Glenwood Avenue are both classified as 6-lane facilities. So that would not change under this. All that would change is when development goes into place, or if there's public projects, what the standard for bicycle accommodation would be that's different from the current standard to the new standard being suggested. Okay.
And then my last question is, when, say, a sidewalk petition is requested and it is classified within a 246 Avenue, will this be a part of it? This designation for bike and ped, will that be a designation when doing sidewalks?
So let me clarify something. So we have a petition process in the city, and the petitions apply specifically mostly to neighborhood streets. Mm-hmm. So on the major roads, we have a city-initiated sidewalk process. Okay. So, and in most cases, we've gone through and outlined where all the missing gaps are along major streets. That's actually a really good question. We haven't gotten into the weeds on some of the pending sidewalk projects to look at whether or not we would need to go back and retrofit with these new sidewalk facilities or not. The city has some latitude as far as the standards we can apply with our public projects. So, for example, the city has the ability that if the city standard right now for a sidewalk is 6 feet wide, but there may be a context in which only a 5-foot sidewalk would fit. We have that latitude to be able to do that because our public projects take place outside of the development realm. So they're not exactly held to the same standards that a private development project is, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't necessarily be required to go back and not put in a bicycle facility if we were just filling in a sidewalk situation. However, that's not to say that we shouldn't look at those opportunities now with these new cross sections and see if there's opportunities to do so. The real, I've used this word frequently throughout my career. The secret word is context. It's always a matter of what's happening within that space. So, for example, it wouldn't make much sense for us to go in and build, say, 2 blocks of extensive sidewalk and bike lane frontage if there's no continuity or connections that result from that on either end. So it's about developing the right facility for the right place. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I'll just say, and I understand not trying to get down into the weeds, but I'll just say in terms of concern of the continuity, that all parts of Raleigh look similar and everyone is afforded the same safety measure.
Completely.
So,
Completely.
thank you.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Commissioner Littman? You're muted.
Sorry about that. My computer might be on a delay as well. How does this coincide with transit? I mean, sorry, bus transit. So how does that, and bus stop, how does that all kind of fold in together? You've got the bike lanes and then the bus routes.
If you can give me a second, I'll try and find an example. So let's see how good my Googling is here. Okay, I can give you a quick example here. Share screen. So one of the things that has come out in the past few years is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is known as NACTO. And they've helped to start to standardize some of these different design techniques. And so what I've got in this image here, which I don't think I can isolate, is the notion that where we have these bus stops, that we can run the bike lane then behind the bus stop in those cases. And this is very similar to the design that we're going to be implementing on Oberlin Road as part of the upcoming Oberlin Road Streetscape project. And so there's different ways to design how pedestrians move from the sidewalk realm into the bus stop realm. There's different ways to do that. I've seen it when there's crosswalks and ramps. I've seen it when the bike lane is actually elevated to the same level as the sidewalk and the transit stop. There's a few different ways to do that, but we're also incorporating the same design into the widening of Blue Ridge Road north of Rex Hospital, between Rex Hospital and Crabtree Valley Mall. We've got numerous transit stops there, and the bike lane will actually run behind the bus stops. So that's how you do that in this context.
Commissioner Littman?
I wonder if, as a group, we can think about an example that we can apply so that we can kind of see, for example, like the Oberlin or the Blue Ridge expansion, to actually see kind of like a timeline or step-by-step or schematics of how that will look. It's just to apply it to real world would be helpful.
I may be able to pull up project plans if you give me 1 second. And Oberlin is probably easier. There we go. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So here are the current design schematics for the Oberlin Road Streetscape project, which runs from the Poland Road roundabout and runs north of the Village District. So what you can see in this case, this is a good example right here in this part of the project. So we'll have basically a floating bus stop. If that makes sense. So right now, if you can picture, Oberlin Road is currently a 5-lane road. So this falls colloquially in what was sometimes referred to as a road diet. We're going from 5 travel lanes down to 3 travel lanes. And that's okay for several reasons. One, it matches the cross sections on either end of what's out there in the 5-lane sections now. And 2, the traffic volumes are commensurate with a 3-lane section today. But you can see here how the bus lane will be on an island out here. And then we're adding in bike lanes. You can see the buffered bike lane runs behind the bus stop. I believe there's a similar treatment further to this direction. One of the other things this is allowing us to do is to be able to add in new on-street parking. And so that's a new benefit for the businesses that are out here, and again, creates what we were talking about with that separated bike lane behind the parked cars. So this will be the first parking protected bike lane in Raleigh. So yeah, so there's a good example here. And this is a fairly urban context, but that's responding to the urbanization of this part of Oberlin Road. Any questions about this project, this layout? Ms. Lampman, was that more on lines of what you were thinking?
Yeah, I have many, and in context of what you described earlier too, you know, for example, we just approved a rezoning, I think, on that far corner where the circle is for Oberlin. And so, you know, did our approval of that encompass future changes? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's that island right by the Poland Road, so maybe it's not on this one. But I guess the global question would be, when we get, you know, a zoning request, do you guys look at it from the standpoint, if, you know, someone on Oberlin Road and you've got this plan, is that included in the presentation and down to how much frontage the city will need?
Okay, so that gets into a very specific conversation about when we have a development plan that's located along a street that's been slated for a capital improvement project, whether it's being done by the city or being done by NCDOT. And that requires a significant amount of coordination. I would point to the Smokey Hollow project as probably being the most complicated version of that we've done in recent memory, where NCDOT was replacing the bridges at Peace Street and at Wade Avenue along Capitol Boulevard, and reworking the interchanges. And we had done that in a way that we wanted to incentivize redevelopment and put in a better urban form with restoring some street grid over in that area. And then we had development come into the picture with the Smokey Hollow multi-story project. So there's a lot of coordination in that case on what was the public project's responsibility and what was the developer's responsibility. Now, in that specific instance, the public project development was pretty far along at the time that the private development interest came in. So, and in that case, the sort of what's been approved as part of the public project is what sets the standard for that frontage. And it's up to us to coordinate how the private developer fits. And we're talking about things like utility impacts and grading impacts and temporary traffic work zones and such. So that one was an extremely complicated example. With regards to Oberlin, there's the redevelopment of the old post office. That's a really easy example, because in that case, because we already had a public project in place and moving forward, that development shows up and really doesn't have any public frontage development responsibilities as part of it. The city's already done the right-of-way acquisition. The city's already established what that exact frontage is going to be, and the development is plug and play at that point. Where it gets a little more difficult is when a developer shows up and project is in early development. And the question is, oftentimes we'll work with the developer to go ahead and do those right-of-way dedications for us and set aside easements that allow us to do the construction work without impacting the property. But they'll pay, for example, a fee in lieu of making any of those frontage improvements required by the city, because we don't want a situation where a developer goes in with a pending capital project, makes a bunch of frontage improvements, and then our contractor comes in and maybe it's not quite right, or maybe it's a different elevation or a different dimension, and that becomes a problem. So oftentimes when we've got a development plan that's encroaching on a public project, we kind of want the developer to do their thing and get out of the way and let the public project go in place, because that makes for a cohesive and consistent end product at the end of the day.
Go ahead, Commissioner Lemon.
Sorry, I have one more question, and I apologize. They might be another big one. The transit bond that was passed a few years ago, and I think we're going to be looking at another transit bond. Are these projects earmarked within that bond pretty early on, or how does that? Because I would assume that when you're talking about funding these projects, that a lot of that will come from a bond, but maybe I'm incorrect.
Let me parse. There was the transit referendum, which was the half-cent sales tax for public transit. That was in 2016. And then in 2017, we had the transportation bond referendum. And that was a $206 million referendum that allocated money for specific projects. Is that what you're referring to?
Basically, city financing of these projects and how the money gets earmarked for certain projects.
Oh, okay. Well, that's very much straightforward. So as part of a transportation bond referendum, the city develops a suite of potential projects and allocations for that that would be put forth if the transportation bond is approved. And we use that information as part of the marketing materials for those bonds to say, and remember, so for folks that are watching at home that may not otherwise not know, when you're doing a transportation bond, it's effectively the same thing as taking out a mortgage. You're basically borrowing that money and you're paying it back to investors over a 20, 30-year time frame. And the advantage that those bonds allow us to do is to, as opposed to putting it into a pay-as-you-go program based on tax revenue, it allows us to get that money sooner, build those projects quicker at ostensibly a lower cost in an earlier year than a more inflated cost in a later year. And then we pay that back with the mortgage, the bond investment. So we advertise based on the city council's direction which projects and which programs we get funded. So projects we've talked about here with Oberlin Road, Blue Ridge Road, for example, those projects identified as part of the transportation bond package. And we include projects all over the city to maintain geographic equity as part of those transportation bonds, because ultimately these are going up for a vote. And so once the vote is done, and let's say the bond is approved as it was in 2017, then those revenues are then allocated on an annual basis as part of the city's capital improvement program. The CIP is a partner portion of the budget process that the city council goes through, in addition to the operating budget of the city. So there's the core operating budget, and then there's the capital improvement program. And the capital improvement program shows how we intend to spend those funds over a 5-year period, and it lays out every single project and what the time frame for those projects are and how that money will be allocated. That program gets reevaluated on an annual basis by the city council, and that's where our marching orders come from, basically, on which projects are priority and which projects to implement.
Okay, let's see. We have about 5 minutes left. I have a question, maybe two. I think one of them, Eric, we've been getting emails about how at the rezoning stage, we might be able to incorporate conditions to have developers include bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure or amenities. It sounds like what you're saying is, aside from the fact that we can't require them to do anything, it sounds like maybe it's a lot of these improvements are best done at the code level versus trying to put it in a rezoning condition, like requiring, or not requiring them, but requesting that they add a condition for a sidewalk or a bike lane or
Right.
something like, is that right?
I think again, context is the key consideration. What's right for that context? A good example might be when there's some specific context that would be favorable to having a development exceed those standards. So for example, the city's standard sidewalk is 6 feet wide. Well, perhaps there's a context for some unique pedestrian demand, something physical that says, maybe a 10-foot sidewalk would be more appropriate. And that type of thing a developer could offer as a condition that's in excess of the city standards. And so there's no design adjustments or variances associated with that when a developer builds in excess of the city standard. David, I would ask the question from your standpoint, if a developer offered a condition with a conditional use zoning case for a different design standard, and we'll talk about the bike lane behind the curb versus in the street, could a developer condition their way out of providing that minimum bike lane standard in the street and move it behind the curb as part of a condition on the zoning case?
Right now, the only conditions that are allowed for a conditional use zoning case that relieve a developer of a code requirement deals with the block perimeter. It's specifically spelled out that only changes to, I think it's Article 8.3 in the code, which usually deals with block perimeter, cross access, and so forth.
Right.
Can someone condition their way out of compliance? So they could set a condition that had a larger block perimeter maximum than the code requires, for example.
Thank you for clarifying that. So now the one class of zoning where you can get really flexible is with the planned development district. And so with that zoning category specifically allows for developers to submit alternative street standards. And in that case, they can vary significantly from what the city's adopted standards are. And so it's a very custom district. And so as part of the PD, the developer could change those standards as long as it meets the city's minimum intent. So they couldn't say, oh, well, you said this road is meant to be 4 lanes, we're just going to build 3. They couldn't do that and meet our standards. But to say we're going to build 4 lanes, but we're going to do narrower lanes and much wider sidewalks and different bike facilities, you could propose that as part of the PD.
And I think,
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I think that I'm not sure if the campus, no one's done a campus master plan yet, but I think campus master plan allows similar. I don't know if it has all the flexibility of a PD, but yeah, it's very
just
limited.
From memory, I don't think it has with regards to street standards. It does with regards to street spacing and grid requirements. So it does have an alternative there for sure. Okay. But I'd have to go back and look to be 100% sure on the question.
And I thought I saw your hand. Did you have a comment to it?
Yeah. Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought there was a case recently on Raleigh where they had a condition to connect to a greenway as part of zoning case. So that's one example of an improvement beyond what's required that's beneficial to the bike ped network. And I guess I wondered to David, if could they have a condition to extend bike lanes beyond their frontage to some other bike lane to complete a link, like an off-site improvement?
Yeah, as Eric mentioned earlier, I mean, if the applicant wants to offer that up as a further incentive for support for their request, they could do so. We just couldn't require it of them.
Right. Okay. That just seems like a big opportunity to me because, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Mm-hmm. I think some of the concerns that I've seen in emails have been along the lines of a lot of these rezonings particularly the ones that require TIA, require improvements or mitigation that is auto-centric. So you're helping the flow of vehicles, but it might, if you're adding turn lanes or something, it might be making it less desirable for bicycles and pedestrians. And how might we account for that, or could we, in a rezoning, or is that something that would take place at site plan?
I think it's important to be cognizant of those types of potential impacts as part of the zoning process. I think that's very important for the commission. The details of those things do get worked out at the site plan process, because ultimately, as part of rezoning, they're setting a maximum potential yield based on that zoning category. And the one that's always a big point of conversation is the DX40 category, because DX40 is a really substantial allowance. It's meant specifically for the core of downtown, and oftentimes, because right now we don't have a benchmark between DX20 and DX40, somebody that wants to go 25 stories is applying for a 40-story entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
And from the rezoning perspective, we are requiring the developers, with the traffic analysis done as part of the rezoning process, to look at that worst case scenario, because that is what the city is approving. Now, in the case where someone offers a condition that says we're going to limit our height to 25 stories, that allows us to bring the traffic analysis at the rezoning stage a little closer to reality. But the practice is, though, that it's not until the developer comes in with an actual plan at the site plan stage, and they know exactly what their square footages are going to be, that we can start to dial in using national averages for traffic yield based on those types of development, to start to see what those impacts are likely going to be, and then start to look at those improvements on the ground. So we're mindful about that balance between serving traffic on an operational front to being able to make sure we're still maintaining a safe environment for all users. One of the things that is in the city code that's a little different than DOT, we talk about level of service for vehicular traffic on an A to F scale. And that equates to different levels of delay, average delay that motorists would experience primarily at an intersection. NCDOT has a level of service D standard, which equates to, and I think, what is that, about 55, 60 seconds of net delay, I think, average delay. It's in that ballpark. So when a developer comes in, DOT is trying to make sure that the development impact doesn't worsen that level of service below that level of service D standard. The city standard is actually level of service E, which is, I think, closer to between 60 and 70 seconds of delay. And part of that is because we're more reticent to make those improvements that would require additional turn lanes, because of the recognition that as we add extra asphalt at intersections, we're increasing that distance that pedestrians have to travel across it on foot. So we don't want to add that infrastructure unless we really, really have to. And that's why we've got a different level of service standard than the state.
Okay. Well, we are at our limit, but I think we probably have some more questions. This was really good and informative. So we'll talk about how we might continue the conversation at our next meeting. But Ann and Eric, I really appreciate it. This was really helpful, and I hope it's helpful to people viewing as well. So if there is nothing else, we will adjourn this meeting, and I'll see you commissioners at Committee of the Whole. David, will you be there too? Okay, see you there.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.